In Russia, protests against the Kremlin's occupation policies in Ukraine have reached a record high. Dissident Russian local government officials have condemned the disastrous results of the war. Current and former Russian municipal officials have published an open letter urging Russian forces to return to the universally recognized borders of Russia. Amid the crisis caused by the collapse of the Kakhovka hydroelectric power plant dam, hundreds of municipal officials from Moscow, St. Petersburg, and the Leningrad regions have signed the document, which argues that the collapse of the dam will have long-lasting effects on the planet's ecosystem, health, and economy. The letter states that Putin's actions since February 24, 2022, have caused uncertain and catastrophic events. However, the ongoing Russian military operations in Ukraine were not cited as the reason for the withdrawal of Russian forces. Russian officials may be using public concerns about the environmental and humanitarian situation related to the dam to voice their opposition to the war in Ukraine without directly criticizing the war effort itself. But the fact that even Russian municipal officials and important Russian bureaucrats openly oppose Vladimir Putin's war policies in Ukraine and publish such a remarkable letter is one of the most concrete proofs that something is wrong with the Moscow administration in terms of politics. This situation may cause alarm bells to ring much more painfully for the Russian leader, Vladimir Putin, and the Kremlin officials in the future. Currently, Putin and his leaders are subject to heavy criticism from Russian citizens due to the failures in Ukraine. If the situation in Ukraine continues in this way, very difficult times await the Kremlin administration, which supports Putin and the Russian leader. On the other hand, the Kremlin has largely determined the conditions for cracking down on the anti-war opposition. However, despite the measures taken by the Russian authorities against negative and opposing views, anti-war riots and protests in Russia may be paving the way for the end of Moscow politically and economically. International intelligence reports and sources constantly publish remarkable posts about this critical process in Russia. Analysts and experts who make important assessments about the war argue that the world would be better off if Moscow's terrible dictatorship no longer controls 1/10 of all the land on Earth and a nuclear arsenal. This thought is actually quite true because, among other costly Cold War misfortunes, Moscow has been greatly weakened as a result of the internal political stalemate during the war in Ukraine, the economic downturn, and heightened ethnic tensions across the vast empire. The collapse came quickly, with little violence. Despite still being the largest country in the world geographically, Russia currently represents only 3.4% of the world GDP. Russia is financially bankrupt, its military has slumped and been discredited, its reputation is ruined, and the Russians' European energy customers are now their mortal enemies. Russia's alienated ethnic minorities have been disproportionately killed as cannon fodder in Ukraine, and dozens of separatist movements have grown faster than they did in 1991. In other words, Russia is rapidly moving towards collapse. But the question is not whether Russia will break up, but when and how. Riots in Russia and anti-Putin protests are increasing these possibilities, especially in recent days. Will there be a messy, violent Yugoslav situation in Russia after the Ukraine war, or will it more likely break up without violence, as the Soviet Union did? There are very critical evaluations on this subject. Let's explore together the shared assessments about Russia after the Ukraine war and see what Vladimir Putin will make of his country in the future. Some regions in Russia with interconnected societies may begin to demand greater autonomy, or these societies may simply leave Russia. The most likely candidates for secession would be regions around Russia that have identities such as former Soviet republics, leaders, and reasonable economic prospects. In 1991, Ukraine easily split as the former Warsaw Pact satellites became nation-states before they were bought by the Kremlin after World War II. Ukraine, on the other hand, easily separated from Russia as all 15 former Soviet republics, such as the Baltics and Central Asia, were already semi-autonomous nation-states. There are dozens of potential new countries that are expected to leave Russia, but their departure from Russia is far from certain, except in a few areas. For example, Karelia, a scenic region in the northwest corner of Russia that Finland was forced to cede to Moscow in 1940. Karelians are a Finnish ethnic group, and a political movement exists in Finland to reclaim it. Likewise, Estonia and Latvia had to leave the lands they would have gladly regained to Russia after the Second World War. Then there's Kaliningrad, which is separated from Russia and stuck between Lithuania and Poland. This is an ice-free port on the Baltic Sea, taken from Germany by Russia in 1945. Kaliningrad could become a viable fourth Baltic republic because its population of 500,000 is economically viable. This area is the size of Montenegro. If Kaliningrad leaves Russia or is left to Poland, the Russian naval forces may also become ineffective in the Baltics. Therefore, the future situation of the Kaliningrad special region is of great importance. It is said that serious uprisings against the war policies of the Russian leader Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin are still continuing in this region at the moment. There are other viable European assets in Russia's southwestern region between the Black and Caspian Seas. Among the likely candidates to leave Russia in these regions is a resurrected version of the North Caucasian Republic, which existed between 1918 and 1922 and includes Chechnya and 6 others. Among these notable nations is Chechnya. Although Chechen leader Ramzan Kadyrov is seen as the adopted son of Vladimir Putin, if Russia suffers a heavy defeat as a result of the Ukraine war, Chechens can also use it for economic and political independence. Currently, the people in Chechnya are also largely against the Russian occupation of Ukraine. Kadyrov often forcibly sends his soldiers to fight alongside the Russian army in Ukraine. Another possible nation-state that is predicted to separate from Russia is the Ural Republic, which was proposed and proclaimed in 1923 but never created. It consisted of 11 districts east of the Ural Mountains. Therefore, both republics, if independent now, may be economically eligible to be completely independent from Russia in the future. In the event that all these regions we have mentioned leave Russia, Putin may face the unbelievable negatives that history has inflicted on Russia. As a result, the Russian Federation, which shrank from 22.4 million km to 17 million km, would shrink even more after the Ukraine war. We can see all these scenarios come true with Russia's defeat in the Ukraine war. The disintegration of the Russian Federation would be daunting and challenging, but a welcome development. The West, on the other hand, is not ready for the possibility of Russia's disintegration. However, going forward, the economy, post-war situation, and leadership will determine Russia's future structure. A new regime might hold it together by loosening controls and sharing wealth to preserve Russian unity. But post-war Russia may not. The prospect of a complete liquidation in Russia sounds very remote, but current circumstances make it possible. However, it's estimated that Russia will be too weak to intervene economically or politically, even in autonomous and minority republics, due to the Ukraine war. Considering all these shared views, Putin has 2 choices. The first is to end this war and save Russia from further negative effects. Putin's second option, as we mentioned in the video, is to watch the war destroy Russia. The Russians' plans for Donbass and Crimea and the Ukrainians' efforts to regain their freedom increase the tension in the second year of the war, especially at the beginning of this week. Ukrainian forces reflected on their successful advances on the front lines. Mobility has increased in Mariupol and Melitopol, one of the most critical front lines of the Crimean Peninsula in the south of Ukraine and the Donetsk region in the east of the country. The reason for the rise in tension in Crimea is considered to be the airstrikes and counterattacks carried out by the Ukrainian army in the last week. You may remember that the Ukrainian armed forces have targeted Crimea many times in the last weeks. Tsankawi, Sevastopol, and Armyansk, located on the border with the Kherson region of the peninsula, were subjected to attacks by unmanned aerial vehicles of Ukrainian forces. As a result of these attacks, an atmosphere of fear and panic naturally arose in the peninsula. The Kremlin administration does not hide its intention to forcibly evacuate the peninsula against the possible attack of the Ukrainian army. In addition, the Russians in Crimea have already begun to leave against possible attacks and sabotage. The residents have already greatly increased their escape from the peninsula since the first days of February 2023. Now, as a result of the last striking attacks of the Ukrainian forces on the peninsula, the flight from Crimea has reached its peak, especially after the drone attacks on Sevastopol. The voyages of some Russian ships in the Black Sea were prevented. Today, however, news emerged that some additional flights have begun to be rescheduled in the peninsula. The resumption of mass escapes by the residents with some additional expeditions that began today has seriously stirred up the atmosphere in Crimea. The families and relatives of the Russian forces on the peninsula had been making preparations to flee from the Crimea for a long time. Those who were preparing to flee by selling their immovables and real estate started to fill the piers in Crimea again. The fact that all the ships docked at the pier were packed and the voyages were carried out at intervals last week was one of the clearest proofs that revealed the true face of the war on the peninsula. On the other hand, the Russian authorities in the peninsula began to hide the heavy losses of the war and to spread rhetoric that Crimea was protected against attacks in order to calm this panic atmosphere there and prevent the escape of the peninsula residents. Yes, the Russians had deployed most of the air defense systems in the southern regions of Ukraine to the Crimea. But despite all these security measures, the Ukrainian forces could repeatedly target the peninsula with drones. And even the purpose of some of the Ukrainian airstrikes on the peninsula was only to learn the location of the Russian air defense systems. For this reason, even though the Russians tried to move their air defense systems to Crimea intensively, this situation did not matter much as the Ukrainian forces knew the location of the most strategic defense systems in Crimea, thanks to the UAV attacks they carried out. For this reason, the inhabitants of Crimea are doing their best to escape from the peninsula, especially before the anniversary of the war on February 24th. As a result, it is estimated that approximately 350,000 people fled from the peninsula, which has a population of 2.5 million. These include mostly Russians, but other ethnic populations are thought to have fled. While this figure is increasing day by day, the proxy Russian administration cannot do anything to stop the escape from the peninsula because the inhabitants of the peninsula received serious socio-economic injuries due to the war. The high prices of even the most basic needs in Crimea make it very difficult to make a living here. On the other hand, the most fundamental factor in the peak of the escapes from Crimea is the lack of life safety of the people living in the region. Attacks by Ukrainian forces are usually aimed at Russian military resources on the peninsula. However, the lives of civilians are also in danger as a result of the Russians' response to these attacks or attempts to shoot down Ukrainian UAVs. That's why nobody wants to stay in Crimea anymore. Of course, there is a small part of the peninsula that wants the Russians to continue the war. However, the main purpose of this war and pro-Russian support groups is considered to be the Russian administration's attempt to impose its aggressive war policies. This war strategy of the Russian administration, which does not care much about the record losses, has not changed since the first days. It's not surprising that the Russians, who lost about 180,000 soldiers in the war, put their citizens living in Crimea at risk. The Crimean Peninsula is not the only place where the severe effects of the Ukrainian war have been experienced. Due to the war, the city of Mariupol has started to become very active these days, just like the Crimea. If you remember, it was reported that the Russian positions in the village of Nikolskaya and a school were hit recently. These attacks, carried out by the Ukrainian forces in Mariupol, greatly affected other settlements as well as Nikolskaya as the Russians took action to carry out retaliatory attacks and take precautions against these attacks. The tension in the city suddenly rose again. As reported, the Russian invaders strengthened their checkpoints at the entrances to Mariupol. Sniper groups. In addition, many reinforcements of Russian infantry groups carried out serious attacks in the city. As a result, Russian aggression caused one of the greatest humanitarian disasters in Mariupol. As a result of the bombardment of the Russian forces, the city is now almost 90% destroyed. It was reported that more than half of Mariupol, which has a population of 450,000 people, left the city. Nearly 250,000 residents left the city on ships from the port of Mariupol, never to return. The clashes in the city, which was almost destroyed as a result of these escapes, began to calm down to a large extent. On the other hand, similar activities took place in the Zaporizhia region this week with the explosions that took place in Berdyansk, which was temporarily seized. The region was reactivated after more than 100 Russian invaders were killed. With the increase in the panic environment, the Russians in this region began to leave Berdyansk due to possible attacks by the Ukrainian forces. As a result, the Ukrainian forces almost caused the Russians to make mass escapes on the southern front lines and in some parts of Donetsk. In this way, the Ukrainians who took control of the battlefield much more gained a great advantage before the anniversary of the war. On the other hand, at the beginning of this week, there was another striking situation that affected the war. A critical move came from the USA in this important time period when the escapes increased and the war began to show its true face much more. Biden visited Kiev, promised $500 million in new weapons aid to Ukraine. US President Joe Biden, who made a surprise visit to Kiev 4 days before the first year of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, gave the message to President Volodymyr Zelensky that Washington is with him until the end. Among the weapons Biden promised are artillery shells, anti-tank ammunition, and alarm systems against airstrikes. The U.S. president also promised to impose a series of additional sanctions on Russia. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky published the footage of the moment. He shook hands with U.S. President Biden, who gave a strong message of support to his country with his visit on his Telegram page. In a statement shared by Zelensky on a social media account, Joseph Biden welcomed to Kiev. "Your visit is a very important sign of support for all Ukrainians," he wrote. On the other hand, Biden, who made critical statements during his visit to Ukraine, said, "With my visit to Kiev, we reaffirm our unwavering commitment to Ukraine's democracy, sovereignty, and territorial integrity." When Putin launched his invasion about a year ago, he thought Ukraine was weak and the West was divided. He thought he could outlast us, but he was sorely mistaken. Biden, who said that the Ukrainians paid a great price and made great sacrifices, signaled that the support provided to the Ukrainians would continue with these statements. Biden's visit was kept secret for security reasons. When Zelensky and Biden left St. Michael's Cathedral, sirens were heard in Kiev. However, there was no news of an air attack or a missile hitting the city. Many streets in Kiev were closed to traffic this morning after the U.S. president's visit. The business in Kiev resumed as before. After Ukraine, Biden will travel to Poland today for a 3-day visit. After this critical visit, EU foreign ministers will meet in Brussels to discuss ammunition aid to Ukraine. Bakhmut clashes between Ukrainian and Russian armies flared up as a result of the counterattack led by the Ukrainian 3rd Assault Brigade. The Russian troops abandoned their positions. The Ukrainian offensive inflicted heavy losses on the Russian army and exposed the tactical errors of the Russians. The months-long war in Bakhmut reached a turning point this weekend when Russia claimed it had captured the eastern Ukrainian city. But the area has long been viewed by military experts as tactically insignificant area. Now, independent analysts say Ukraine could have an advantage if Russia had to spend resources defending a city that is now completely in ruins. While Ukrainian forces prepare a counterattack, the commander of the ground forces of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Colonel General Oleksandr Chiosek, visited the forward positions near Bakhmut. General Kursk visited the valiant Ukrainian soldiers and their commanders at the front. The soldiers of the 3rd Separate Assault Brigade, the 30th Separate Mechanized Brigade, the 56th Separate Motorized Infantry Brigade, and the 93rd Separate Mechanized Brigade, who eliminated the Russian army every day, were given thanks and refreshments. The Ukrainian Defense Forces continue defensive operations on the flanks around Bakhmut. Although the outskirts of the city are currently under the control of the Ukrainian army, the line of defense is still more important in the future. This will give the Ukrainian army the opportunity to enter the city with ease when the operational situation on the front changes. Kursk has also added that he has discussed further actions of the defense forces with the commanders of the troops in Bakhmut, and that the Ukrainian army will defend Bakhmut to the end. Over the weekend, Russia's defense ministry first supported the claim of the head of the Wagner paramilitary group Prigozhin that Russian forces had captured Bakhmut. President Vladimir Zelensky, who surprisingly attended the G7 summit the previous day, opposed the claim. However, he admitted that the city had suffered great destruction, saying that Bakhmut is now only in our hearts except for small parts of the city, including an area near Druzhba Square. The city was reportedly largely under Russian control, according to U.S. officials, while military experts argued that the region does not provide a strategic advantage. Russia has launched an attack on the city, which has been in ruins for 10 months and is believed to have claimed thousands of lives on both sides. The last few urban blocks of eastern Bakhmut, which Prigozhin claims to have captured by Wagner Group forces, are of no tactical or operational significance. The fact that this area is under Russian control does not provide Russian forces an operationally important area to continue their offensive operations or a particularly strong position to defend against possible Ukrainian counterattacks. So why does Russia want Bakhmut so much? Russia's desire to capture Bakhmut is nothing more than a largely symbolic victory. Perhaps it could be a salvage measure for Prigozhin, who is reported to have recruited around 50,000 personnel to fight in the war in Ukraine. The war in Bakhmut at times put the Wagner leader at odds with Russian President Vladimir Putin. In recent weeks, Prigozhin has accused the Russian leader of not providing enough supplies for his paramilitary group and has threatened to give Ukraine the location information of Russian troops on the front lines in Bakhmut in exchange for mercy to his troops. Prigozhin later said that this claim was a hoax beyond a symbolic victory. Bakhmut, dubbed a meat grinder to reflect the region's deadly conditions, has other variants that could put Russia in a difficult position. After injecting huge amounts of resources into the Donetsk region. So what are these variables? First, Russia may now want to invest in defending its claimed control over Bakhmut. Russia has likely redeployed several battalions to reinforce the Bakhmut area. According to the latest UK Department of Defense intelligence report, the Russian General Staff also approved this deployment. This could pose a problem for Russia if it hopes to prepare for a Ukrainian counteroffensive to Bakhmut, for which Ukraine has been preparing for weeks. And at the same time, Ukraine continues to launch counterattacks on the outskirts of the city. Western analysts said that Russian forces will likely need additional reinforcements to hold Bakhmut city and its flanks at the expenses of operations in other directions. Ukrainian officials, on the other hand, are reluctant to give precise information on where the next counterattack might take place. However, military experts and analysts predict that the attack could be concentrated in the Zaporizhia region in the southeast of Ukraine. Independent military strategists said carrying out a successful counterattack would be critical for Ukraine so that the country could provide a convincing justification for continued support from Western countries and NATO allies. Prigozhin said he plans to withdraw his troops from Bakhmut by May the 25th after declaring victory at Bakhmut last week. But the continued presence of Ukrainian forces in the region could complicate those efforts. But it is unlikely that the Russian military command will build up enough forces to relieve Wagner at Bakhmut and keep his flanks within the window, Prigozhin has announced. Without redeploying Russian forces in other areas, it is very likely that Prigozhin made these statements as a crude attempt to discourage Ukraine from launching a counterattack in the city. It is known by everyone that the Wagner leader has made harsh statements before and has taken a step back in these statements. Although the Kremlin and Prigozhin say that Bakhmut is completely under Russian control, satellite images from the region and the visit of the Ukrainian chief of staff to Bakhmut are more than enough to refute these claims. The most fierce battles of the Ukrainian war took place in Bakhmut, and as a result of these conflicts, the city of Bakhmut was almost completely destroyed. Homes, schools, and businesses have been blown up and turned into rubble by months of incessant fighting, and most of the city's inhabitants have already left Bakhmut. What remains of this quiet industrial town is a scarred landscape where thousands of lives have ended. New satellite images from the United States slap the scale of devastation wrought by the war for Bakhmut, a small industrial city in Ukraine's Donetsk region. The terrible struggle that began last summer has become the longest and bloodiest battle of the war in Ukraine. The war has witnessed some of the hardest and most intense conflicts and massive losses, and it's not over yet. Both sides are fighting fiercely for Bakhmut, and this is the biggest indicator that the Bakhmut war will not end in the short term. The Russian army and Wagner mercenaries began their siege of the city last August, but the city has been regularly bombarded before that, and for 10 months the two armies have been fighting to take control of the city. The Ukrainian army is putting up fierce resistance, but it is unclear whether they will be able to withstand the Russian offensive any longer. The footage served shows how the town of about 73,000 people was torn apart and turned into a fierce battlefield. Despite such great destruction, the fate of the city and which side can outlast the other remains unclear. Considering the current situation, the huge losses of the Russian army embankment reinforce the thoughts that the Russian army will be the first to give up. Russian President Vladimir Putin has not been able to confront his people with a war win since the Ukraine war started. If the Russian army wins the Battle of Bakhmut, Putin will present it to his people as a great war victory. In this way, both the public support for the war will increase and the morale of the unmotivated Russian army will increase from the Ukrainian point of view. Stopping the Russian army in Bakhmut will stop Russia's westward advance. And with the momentum this situation provides, the Ukrainian army will liberate the Russian-controlled eastern cities one by one. Therefore, the symbolic value of Bakhmut among the two warring countries is quite high. And this is the only reason that keeps both armies afloat.